Millionaire marries his high school teacher, but his daughter arrives and changes life forever. Ethan Montgomery gazed out over New York City from his office on the 45th floor. The skyscrapers stretching as far as the eye could see seemed small compared to the empire he had built at just 29 years old. Montgomery Tech was now one of the largest technology companies in North America, valued at billions of dollars. But on that Friday afternoon, as the city prepared for another weekend, the young entrepreneur felt the familiar weight of loneliness. "Mr. Montgomery, the meeting with investors is confirmed for Monday," announced Olivia, his executive assistant, interrupting his thoughts. "And don't forget about the Education Foundation charity event tonight." Ethan nodded, adjusting his tie in front of the full-length mirror that decorated one of the office walls. His reflection showed a tall man with striking features and penetrating green eyes, wearing an impeccably tailored Italian suit. The image was the personification of success, but his eyes carried a melancholy that money could never erase. "Thank you, Olivia. Can you cancel my Monday morning appointments? I want to review the presentation one more time," he requested, without taking his eyes off the window. The charity event was just one of dozens of social engagements that filled his calendar. The Education Foundation was one of the largest educational support organizations in the country, and Ethan had a special interest in their initiatives. Perhaps because education had been his own salvation in the difficult years after losing his parents as a teenager. Upon arriving at the event, held at one of the city's most luxurious hotels, Ethan was immediately surrounded by businessmen, socialites and journalists. Everyone wanted a moment with the young billionaire, whether for a photo, a business conversation, or just to say they knew him. He navigated these situations with practiced ease, distributing polite smiles and firm handshakes. It was during one of these conversation circles that he saw her. Margaret Hawkins was in a quieter corner of the ballroom, animatedly chatting with a small group. Her elegantly styled grey hair and distinctive posture set her apart in the crowd. Something about her awakened a distant memory in Ethan. "That's Margaret Hawkins," commented one of the businessmen at his side, noticing his interest. "One of the most respected educators in the country, developed revolutionary teaching methodologies. They say she turned down invitations from several international universities to continue working with underprivileged children here." Ethan felt his heart race. Margaret Hawkins, his high school literature teacher, the woman who had changed his life at one of the most difficult moments when he was about to give up on everything. She hadn't changed much in the last 15 years. She maintained the same natural elegance and welcoming smile he remembered. Without thinking twice, he excused himself from the group and walked towards her. Margaret noticed him before he even reached her, her brown eyes shining with recognition. "Ethan Montgomery," she said, her smile widening, "the boy who promised he would change the world through technology." "Mrs. Hawkins," he replied, suddenly feeling like the 15-year-old teenager again. "You haven't changed a bit." "And you've grown exactly as I imagined you would," she responded, her eyes studying her former student with affection. "I've seen your name in the newspapers. I'm proud of the man you've become." The conversation flowed naturally, as if the years hadn't passed. Margaret was still the same insightful and warm person Ethan remembered, but there was something more there, a depth he hadn't perceived as a teenager. She talked about her current projects, her concerns about education in the country, and her yet unrealized dreams. "Would you allow me to steal Mrs. Hawkins for a moment?" A deep voice interrupted the conversation. It was Charles Edwards, the president of the Education Foundation. "We need her for the presentation of new projects." Margaret said goodbye with a gentle smile, promising to continue the conversation later. Ethan watched her walk away, feeling an inexplicable restlessness. For the first time in a long time, he didn't want a social event to end. He wanted to keep talking to Margaret, wanted to know more about her life, her thoughts, her experiences. That night, returning to his penthouse apartment in one of New York's most exclusive buildings, Ethan couldn't get Margaret out of his thoughts. The conversation with her had awakened something he had kept dormant for years, a desire for genuine connection, for mutual understanding, for something beyond the superficial relationships that dominated his life. Standing in front of his bedroom window, observing the city lights, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't let Margaret Hawkins disappear from his life again. There was something special about her, something that went beyond the gratitude he felt for his former teacher. It was a connection he couldn't explain, but that, for the first time in a long time, made his heart beat faster. On the Monday following the charity event, Ethan couldn't concentrate on the meeting with investors. His thoughts kept returning to Margaret and the conversation they had. After years of building a technological empire, it was ironic how a simple conversation had affected him so much. "Mr. Montgomery," the voice of one of the investors brought him back to reality. "Do you agree with the expansion into the Asian market next quarter?" Ethan adjusted himself in his chair, reassuming his CEO posture. "We need to reevaluate the timing. Let's focus first on consolidating North America," he responded firmly, but his mind was already formulating another plan. As soon as the meeting ended, he called Olivia into his office. "I need you to find out where Margaret Hawkins is currently teaching," he requested, trying to sound casual. Olivia, always efficient, returned in less than an hour with the information. Margaret was coordinating an innovative technology education project at a public school in the Bronx. Ethan smiled upon learning this. It was so characteristic of her to be where she could really make a difference. Without thinking too much, he grabbed his car keys and drove there. The school was a stark contrast to his luxurious office, peeling walls, old desks, but there was something special about the environment. Colorful posters with student projects decorated the corridors, and animated voices echoed from the classrooms. Margaret was in a room full of computers, guiding a group of teenagers on a basic programming project. Her eyes lit up with surprise when she saw him standing at the door. "Ethan, what a pleasant surprise," she smiled, dismissing the students, who were already finishing the class. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Actually," he began, feeling strangely nervous, "I came to make a proposal. Montgomery Tech has a technology mentoring program, and I thought we could establish a partnership with your school." Margaret observed him with that insightful look he knew so well. "And you came personally to propose this?" "Maybe I also wanted to continue our conversation from the other day," he admitted, feeling like a teenager again under her gaze. What started as a professional meeting transformed into a long chat about education, technology, and dreams. Margaret shared her frustrations with the educational system and her hopes for her students. Ethan talked about the challenges of leading a company in exponential growth and the loneliness that came with success. "You're still the same sensitive boy underneath that businessman facade," Margaret commented softly. "That's rare, you know, maintaining your essence even with all the success." Visits to the school became frequent. Ethan began to actively participate in the project, offering not just resources, but also his time and knowledge. The students adored him, and he found himself looking forward to each new visit, although he knew it wasn't just for the project. Margaret fascinated him more and more. At 52, she had a vitality and a passion for life that infected everyone around her. Their conversations extended far beyond class hours, and soon they began meeting outside of school, cafes, restaurants, walks in the park. "You know what impresses me most about you, Ethan," she said during a dinner. "How you transformed your pain into strength to help others." He observed her for a moment, admiring how the soft light of the restaurant highlighted the silver strands in her hair. "I learned from the best," he replied, his heart racing when he saw the smile she gave him in response. The age difference between them never seemed to be an issue during these conversations. Margaret had a youthfulness of spirit that perfectly matched Ethan's precocious maturity. They complemented each other in a way that neither of them expected. It was during one of these dinners that Ethan realized he was in love. It wasn't a dramatic moment or a sudden epiphany. It was while watching Margaret speak passionately about a new project she wanted to implement, gesticulating animatedly, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. The realization hit him with surprising clarity. He didn't want to live without her in his life anymore. But with this realization came doubts. What would people say? How would this affect their professional lives? And more importantly, did Margaret feel the same way? Did she still see him as her former student, the boy who needed guidance? As the night progressed and they shared stories and laughter, Ethan internally struggled with his feelings. The connection between them was undeniable, but taking the next step would mean facing a world of judgments and prejudices. At the end of the dinner, as they said goodbye at the restaurant door, their gazes met for a moment longer than usual. There was something different in the air, an electric tension that neither of them could ignore. "Margaret," Ethan began, his heart beating fast, "I need to tell you something." "Margaret, you've changed my life twice," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "The first time was when I was a teenager, lost and without direction. And now, 15 years later, you're doing it again." Margaret watched him in silence, her face illuminated by the soft light of the New York night. Her brown eyes, always so expressive, revealed a mixture of emotions that Ethan couldn't fully decipher. "I know it might seem crazy," he continued, gathering courage. "But in these last few months I realized that what I feel for you goes beyond admiration or gratitude. I'm in love with you, Margaret, and I don't care what others will think or say." A moment of silence followed, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Ethan, are you sure? I'm 23, years older than you. I have a completely different life, baggage that you can't even imagine." "Age is just a number," he gently interrupted. "What matters is how I feel when I'm with you, how everything makes sense, how each moment is precious. I've never felt this way with anyone." Margaret smiled, a smile that mixed joy and concern. "I feel something special for you too, Ethan, something I've tried to deny in the last few weeks, telling myself it was inappropriate, that it was just maternal affection. But it's not." Ethan felt his heart race. He took a step forward, eliminating the distance between them. "Then don't deny it. Don't let social conventions or others' opinions dictate our happiness." "People will talk," Margaret warned, although her tone suggested she was already yielding. "Let them talk," Ethan replied, taking her hands in his. "I've spent years building an empire, Margaret, but for the first time in my life I feel like I've found something truly valuable." That night, under the starry sky of New York, they shared their first kiss. It was a moment of pure magic, where age, social status, and conventions lost all meaning. It was just Margaret and Ethan, two hearts that had found in each other something rare and precious. The days that followed were a mix of joy and adaptation. They decided to keep the relationship discreet initially, not out of shame, but to protect that special connection they were building. Margaret continued her work at the school, and Ethan maintained his routine at the company. But now their lives were intertwined in a way neither of them had imagined possible. The nights were filled with intimate dinners, deep conversations, and moments of complicity. Margaret shared stories of her previous marriage, which had ended over a decade ago, and how she had dedicated herself entirely to education since then. Ethan talked about his loneliness, about how professional success had never filled the void left by the loss of his parents. "Sometimes I wonder if they would approve of this life I've built," Ethan confessed one night, as they were cuddled on the couch in his apartment. "All this success, but so little real connection." Margaret caressed his face tenderly. "I'm sure they would be proud of the man you've become. Not for your material success, but for your ability to maintain your humanity, your compassion." It was during a dinner at home that they decided to make the relationship public. "I don't want to hide anymore," Ethan declared. "I want to be able to appear with you at events, introduce you as my girlfriend, build a life together openly." Margaret hesitated for a moment. "Are you prepared for the consequences? The malicious comments, the speculations about our motives?" "I'm prepared for anything as long as it's by your side," he replied with conviction. "Besides, I've never cared what others think. Why would I start now?" The news of their relationship exploded in the media like a bomb. The headlines were sensationalist. Young billionaire admits romance with ex-teacher. Age difference shocks New York society. True love or search for mother figure. But to the surprise of many, Ethan and Margaret faced the storm with dignity and unity. In Nathan interviews, he spoke openly about how Margaret inspired him and made him want to be a better person. She, in turn, demonstrated a calm confidence in their relationship, never letting herself be shaken by malicious comments. Support came from unexpected places. The students at the school where Margaret taught started a social media campaign defending the couple. Progressive business people publicly praised Ethan's courage in following his heart, ignoring outdated social conventions. However, not everything was rosy. Margaret began to receive sideways glances from some colleagues in the profession, and some more conservative investors expressed concern about the company's image. But none of that mattered when they were together, building their dreams and sharing their lives. The marriage proposal happened during a trip to Martha's Vineyard, 6 months after making the relationship public. Ethan had planned every detail: the sunset on the historic beach, the candles decorating the wooden deck, the soft music in the background. Margaret said yes without hesitation, her misty eyes reflecting the orange sky. The news of the engagement spread quickly, reaching the main media outlets in the country. It was through one of these reports that Sarah Hawkins, Margaret's only daughter, learned of her mother's impending marriage. A renowned criminal lawyer in New York, Sarah maintained only superficial contact with Margaret for years. The result: old disagreements and divergent life choices. How could she do this? Sarah muttered to herself, observing the photo of her mother embracing Ethan on the computer screen. He's practically my age. Without thinking twice, Sarah cancelled all her commitments for the week and drove to her mother's apartment. The doorman, who had known her since childhood, allowed her entry without notice. When Margaret opened the door, she was paralyzed for a moment. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Mom," Sarah responded dryly, entering the apartment. Without waiting for an invitation, she stopped when she saw a man's jacket on the sofa. "Is he here?" "Ethan is at the company," Margaret replied, closing the door. "Sarah, I was going to tell you personally." "When, on the wedding day?" Sarah interrupted, her voice laden with irony. "What's gotten into you, Mom? This guy is my age. Do you really think he's with you for love?" Margaret remained calm. Years of teaching experience giving her the necessary patience. "Honey, I know it's hard to understand, but what Ethan and I have is genuine. He makes me happy in a way I haven't felt in years." "He's an opportunist," Sarah exploded. "A young businessman who probably saw in you a way to gain respectability. You've always been too naive, Mum." The discussion was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Ethan entered carrying shopping bags. His smile disappeared when he sensed the tension in the environment. "You must be Sarah," he said, placing the bags on the table. "Margaret talks a lot about you." Sarah examined him from head to toe, her eyes cold as ice. "Interesting. My mother never mentioned you until I saw your photo in the newspapers." The days that followed were a test of patience for everyone. Sarah decided to stay at her mother's apartment, claiming she needed to protect her. Her constant presence created a tense environment, with acidic comments and distrustful looks directed at Ethan whenever he appeared. "She's just worried about me," Margaret tried to justify to Ethan during one of their rare moments alone. "Give her time." But Ethan could see how the situation was affecting Margaret. She was quieter, pensive, the sparkle in her eyes a little less intense. The joy of the engagement had been replaced by a heavy atmosphere of family conflict. One night, while Margaret was sleeping, Ethan found Sarah on the apartment balcony. She was drinking wine, her gaze lost in the illuminated city. "Why don't you just leave?" she asked without turning around. "It would be easier for everyone." "Because I love your mother," Ethan replied simply. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it, not just to her, but to you too." Sarah finally turned to face him. "My mother has always seen the best in people, always believed that everyone has good intentions. Do you know how many times that hurt her? How many times she was disappointed?" "I'm not here to disappoint her," Ethan stated firmly. "I'm here because for the first time in my life, I've found someone who makes me want to be a better person. Someone who understands me completely and accepts me as I am." "Nice speech," Sarah commented, an ironic smile on her lips. "But actions speak louder than words, and I'll be watching your every step." The tension between them was palpable, electrifying the air on the balcony. Two different worlds, two generations, united only by the love they felt for Margaret, albeit in completely different ways. What neither of them realized was that Margaret was observing the scene from the balcony door, her heart torn between love for the man who had brought color back to her life and love for the daughter who, even with all her defenses and harshness, was still a fundamental part of her being. The wedding preparations were advancing. Despite the constant tension in the apartment, Margaret tried to mediate the situation, dividing her time between the two, but her emotional exhaustion was evident. Sarah, meanwhile, began to discreetly investigate Ethan's past, using her contacts in the legal field. It was during one of these investigations that she discovered something intriguing. The Hope Foundation, a project she secretly coordinated to provide scholarships to underprivileged youth, received substantial donations from an anonymous fund. After weeks of searching, Sarah finally discovered the source. Ethan Montgomery. "Why did you never mention it?" She confronted Ethan one morning while Margaret was at school. "The donations to the Hope Foundation. Why maintain anonymity?" Ethan, who was preparing coffee in the kitchen, paused for a moment. Because the purpose wasn't to receive recognition, it was to help young people who, like me once, just need an opportunity. "But you knew I was involved with the foundation." "From day one," he admitted. "Margaret told me about your volunteer work years ago. When I researched, I discovered the foundation and decided to contribute. But I wanted to keep it secret so it wouldn't seem like I was trying to buy you." Sarah sat down, stunned. For months, she had built an image of Ethan as a calculating opportunist. Now that image was starting to crumble. "You really love her, don't you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "More than I thought it was possible to love someone," Ethan replied, sitting across from her. "Your mother saved me twice in life, Sarah. First as a teacher, then as a partner. She showed me that success goes beyond material achievements." At that moment, something subtly changed between them. It wasn't acceptance yet, but the beginning of a mutual understanding. Sarah began to observe Ethan with different eyes, noticing small gestures she had previously ignored. How he always made sure Margaret took her blood pressure medication, how he had memorized her favorite songs, how he looked at her with genuine admiration when she talked about her projects. During a dinner, Margaret watched in surprise as the two began to passionately discuss educational policy. Ethan defended the implementation of technology in public schools, while Sarah argued about the importance of first ensuring basic structures. It was their first real conversation, without veiled hostility. "You two are more alike than you imagine," Margaret commented, a satisfied smile on her lips. The real change, however, happened during an emergency at the foundation. One of the main donors had suddenly withdrawn their support, putting the next semester's scholarship program at risk. Sarah was desperate, trying to find a solution. Ethan, upon learning of the situation, not only doubled his donations, but also mobilized his network of business contacts. Within days, the foundation had received more offers of support than in all previous years combined. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, still processing the turnaround. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. "And because, like it or not, we're family now." That phrase hit Sarah in an unexpected way. Family. It was a word that carried so much weight, so much history. For years, her family had been just her and her mother, and even that relationship was worn. Now here was this man, younger than her, expanding the meaning of that word. One night, as the three of them were having dinner together, Sarah surprised everyone, including herself, by saying, "I think you should consider the Plaza Hotel for the wedding reception. It has the elegance that suits you both." Margaret dropped her fork, silent tears rolling down her face. It was the first time Sarah had shown any support for the wedding. Ethan squeezed Margaret's hand under the table, his heart overflowing, there with emotion. The week leading up to the wedding was full of activities. Margaret divided her time between the last exams at school, the ceremony preparations, and meetings with the caterer. Ethan noticed that she seemed more tired than usual, but she insisted it was just the stress of the preparations. During a dress fitting, Margaret felt a strong dizziness. The seamstress noticed her paleness and suggested she sit down. "It's just fatigue," Margaret tried to reassure everyone. But Sarah, who was present, noticed something wrong in the way her mother was. Holding her chest, "Mum?" Sarah approached, worried. The next moment, Margaret collapsed. The rush to the hospital was a blur. Ethan drove at high speed while Sarah held her mother in the back seat. In the emergency room, doctors quickly identified a heart attack. Margaret was rushed to the ICU. The hours that followed were the longest in Ethan and Sarah's lives. Sitting side by side in the waiting room, all previous differences seemed insignificant in the face of the fear of losing Margaret. "She always took care of everyone but herself," Sarah murmured, breaking the tense silence. "Since I was a child, she put the needs of others before her own." Ethan nodded, his voice choked. "She still does that today. Last week she had a fever, but insisted on teaching because her students had a test." The doctor finally appeared with news. Margaret was stable, but in an induced coma. Her heart had suffered significant damage, and the next few days would be crucial. "You can see her but one at a time," the doctor informed. Ethan and Sarah looked at each other. "You go first," Ethan said. "You're her daughter." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, you go. She would want to see you first." The days turned into an anguishing routine. Ethan and Sarah took turns between the hospital, work, and taking care of practical matters. Without realizing it, they began to depend on each other to endure the situation. One night, as Ethan kept vigil over Margaret's sleep, Sarah silently entered the room. "I brought coffee," she said, offering a cup. "And some memories." It was an old photo album. Together, they spent hours looking at photographs of Margaret over the years. Young teacher, dedicated mother, always with that luminous smile that captivated them both. "Look at this one." Sarah pointed to a photo where Margaret was holding a chess trophy. She organized a tournament at school to encourage students to learn math, typical of her, always finding creative ways to teach. Ethan smiled, recognizing the same passion for education that had won him over. She never changed, did she? Always believing in people's potential. "As she believed in both of us," Sarah completed softly. At that moment, sharing memories and concerns, the last barriers between them began to fall. They were no longer adversaries, but two people united by love for the same extraordinary woman. On the morning of the 5th day, as Ethan was reading aloud one of Margaret's favorite books, she began to show signs of waking up. Sarah, who was dozing on the room's couch, jumped up. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, finding first Ethan's anxious face, then Sarah's. A small smile formed on her lips. "You're here together?" she whispered with difficulty. "Of course we are," Sarah replied, holding one of her mother's hands, while Ethan held the other. "We're a family, aren't we?" The tears in Margaret's eyes said more than any words could express. There in that hospital room, something new was being born. A different family, built not just by blood ties, but by choices of love. Margaret's recovery was slow but steady. After 2 weeks in the hospital, she was discharged with strict recommendations for rest and lifestyle changes. Ethan and Sarah organized a schedule to ensure she was never alone and followed all medical guidelines. During this period, something subtle began to change in the dynamic between Ethan and Sarah. The long shared hours, mutual concerns, and deep conversations during the early hours created an unexpected intimacy between them. One night, while Margaret was sleeping, the two were on the apartment balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about the future. "She'll have to retire," Sarah commented, her voice heavy with concern. "The doctors were clear about that, but knowing my mother, she'll never accept stopping completely," Ethan completed, understanding perfectly. "Maybe we can create something new for her, a project that allows her to continue doing what she loves but with less stress." Sarah observed him with admiration. It was impressive how well he understood her mother. "You really know her," she murmured. Their gazes met for a moment longer than normal, and both quickly looked away, an inexplicable warmth rising in their faces. It was the first time they felt that strange tension between them. The following days were confusing. While caring for Margaret, Ethan and Sarah began to notice small details about each other that previously went unnoticed. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was worried, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the shared laughter over inside, jokes that only they understood. Margaret, always observant, began to notice the subtle changes in their behavior. The furtive glances, the way they avoided being alone for too long, the way their voices changed when speaking to each other. One afternoon, while Ethan was at the company, Margaret called Sarah for a conversation. "Honey, I need to tell you something important," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I've noticed what's happening between you and Ethan." Sarah paled. "Mom, it's not like that. We just—" "Sarah," Margaret gently interrupted, "do you think after so many years as a teacher, I haven't learned to read people? What's growing between you is something genuine and beautiful." "But what about you and the wedding?" Sarah asked, tears forming in her eyes. Margaret smiled, that wise smile she always had when she was about to give an important lesson. Love, sometimes life surprises us with paths we didn't plan. What Ethan and I had was real and precious, but maybe our purpose was different. Maybe I needed him to reconnect with you, and he needed me to find you." "I don't want to hurt you, Mom," Sarah whispered, tears now flowing freely. "It would hurt me more to see you two denying something true because of me," Margaret replied, holding her daughter's hand. "Besides, after this scare, I realized I want something different for my life. I want to travel, write that book I always dreamed of, live without the pressures I always imposed on myself." That night, when Ethan arrived, Margaret asked to talk to him too. With the same serenity, she shared her thoughts and observations. Ethan, initially resistant and confused, found in Margaret the same understanding and wisdom that had made him fall in love with her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice choked. "I'm sure I want to see the two people I love most in the world happy," she replied with a calm smile. "And sometimes for that to happen, we need to have the courage to change our plans." The days that followed were of self-discovery for everyone. Ethan and Sarah, now free from the guilt that consumed them, began to explore the feelings that were growing between them. It was different from anything they had ever felt before, a deep connection built on mutual understanding, respect, and a shared love for Margaret. Margaret surprised everyone by announcing her decision to move to a house on Long Island. She had found a charming property in the Hamptons, with a view of the sea and a spacious garden where she could grow her own flowers. "I've always dreamed of writing, you know," she explained during a dinner. "And now is the perfect time to start. My book on education and social transformation." Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances, concerned about the idea of Margaret living alone after the recent scare. But she was determined. "You two need space to discover what you feel," she said with a serene smile, "and I need a new purpose. Besides, I won't really be alone. I've already signed up for a local writers group and discovered there's a community school in need of educational consulting." The move happened gradually. Margaret started spending a few days a week on Long Island, returning to New York for medical appointments and to see the children. In her absences, Ethan and Sarah grew closer and closer. One Sunday afternoon, while organizing some of Margaret's belongings for the definitive move, they found an old box with photographs. Among them, one caught their attention. A young Margaret smiling next to her students in a social project. "She always had this light, didn't she?" Sarah commented, her fingers gently tracing the photograph. "This ability to see the best in people. That's what made me fall in love with her," Ethan replied softly. "And now I understand that's what brought me to you." Their eyes met, and for the first time, they didn't look away. Ethan leaned in slowly, his lips meeting Sarah's in a soft and hesitant kiss. It was a kiss unlike any other they had ever experienced, laden with history, understanding, and a love that had grown silently between them. Margaret, upon learning of the first kiss through an emotional conversation with her daughter, smiled with genuine happiness. "Love has its own paths," she said. "Sometimes we need to take a few steps back so that others can take steps forward." At the inauguration of Margaret's new house, 3 months later, the atmosphere was celebratory. The property had been transformed into a welcoming space with a library full of books, an office overlooking the sea, and a garden that was beginning to bloom. "Mom, this place is so you," Sarah commented, admiring how every corner reflected Margaret's personality. "It's perfect," Margaret replied, her eyes shining. "You know, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I should be. And so are you two." Ethan hugged Sarah from behind. both watching Margaret walk through the garden, animatedly explaining her plans for a medicinal herb bed. She seemed younger, lighter, as if she had found a new form of happiness. "She's writing an incredible book," Sarah commented. "I read the first chapters yesterday. It's about how love can transform and take different forms without losing its value." "Just like what happened to us," Ethan replied, gently kissing Sarah's neck. That night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, the three shared laughter and stories. Margaret talked about her new projects, her eyes shining with renewed enthusiasm. Ethan and Sarah, holding hands, listened attentively, their hearts overflowing with love and gratitude for the extraordinary woman who had transformed their lives in such unexpected ways. Margaret's first book, Transforming Lives: A Journey Through Education, became an unexpected success. Her experiences as a teacher, combined with her personal story of transformation, touched thousands of readers. Publishers were already vying for the rights to her next work. "I never imagined that at 53 I would be starting a new career," Margaret commented during a lunch with Ethan and Sarah at her home in the Hamptons. The calm sea reflected the afternoon sun, and the gentle breeze swayed the curtains on the porch. The couple visited Margaret regularly, turning these meetings into a sacred tradition. The relationship between the three had found a unique balance, based on love, respect, and mutual understanding. Ethan and Sarah had moved into their own apartment in New York, where they were building their life together. The age difference between them, which once seemed so significant in the eyes of society, became insignificant in the face of the depth of their connection. "You know what's most interesting," Margaret reflected, pouring more wine. "How destiny has curious ways of guiding us. If I hadn't fallen in love with Ethan, maybe you would never have come back into my life, Sarah. And if I hadn't had that health scare, maybe I would never have discovered my vocation as a writer." Sarah smiled, squeezing Ethan's hand under the table. "And if you hadn't been so wise and generous, Mum, maybe Ethan and I would never have allowed ourselves to discover what we felt for each other." The success of the book brought new horizons for Margaret. She began traveling across the country, giving lectures on education and social transformation. Her experience as a teacher, combined with her new life perspective, inspired educators and students wherever she went. At home, Margaret dedicated her mornings to writing her second book, this time exploring how love can transform and mature. Her afternoons were filled with walks on the beach, reading in the garden, and meetings with her local writers group. Ethan and Sarah, in turn, had found a joint purpose. Inspired by Margaret, they created a technology mentoring program within the Hope Foundation, combining Ethan's expertise in technology with Sarah's legal experience to create opportunities for underprivileged youth. "Are you ready for the big step?" Margaret asked, observing the couple tenderly. Ethan and Sarah exchanged knowing looks. The week before, they had decided to get married. It would be an intimate ceremony on the beach in the Hamptons with Margaret, not just as a guest of honor, but as the officiant. "I still can't believe you managed to get the license to marry us," Sarah laughed, hugging her mother. "Well, some advantages of being a famous writer," Margaret winked. "Besides, who better to celebrate this union than the person who helped make it possible?" The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The three remained on the porch, contemplating the view and sharing stories. Margaret talked about her new projects, her eyes shining with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a new passion in life. "You know what I've learned in these last few months," she reflected, "that it's never too late to start over. That love has many forms, and that all of them are valid, and that sometimes we need to let go for something even more beautiful to be born." Ethan and Sarah looked at each other, their hearts overflowing with love and gratitude. The path that brought them here might seem unusual in the eyes of others, but for them it was perfectly natural. It was their story, written with truth, courage, and the transformative love that only Margaret knew how to inspire. The morning of the wedding dawned with a perfectly blue sky in the Hamptons. The private beach had been decorated with white, flowers and ribbons that danced in the sea breeze. Margaret, dressed in an elegant light blue ensemble, was putting the final touches on the decoration while the few guests began to arrive. In the main bedroom of the house, Sarah looked at herself. In the mirror, her flowing white dress reflecting the simplicity and elegance that always characterized her. Margaret entered silently, observing her daughter with misty eyes. "You look beautiful, my daughter," she said, delicately adjusting Sarah's veil. "So beautiful and so happy." "Thanks to you, Mom," Sarah replied, holding Margaret's hands, "for teaching us that true love doesn't follow rules or conventions." On the beach, Ethan waited under an arch of white flowers. His light suit matched the light atmosphere of the beachside wedding. When the music began, all the guests turned to see Sarah walking on the sand, her bare feet leaving soft marks on the path to the altar. Margaret awaited them with a serene smile, a gold-covered book in her hands, her new book, not yet published, where she told the story of how love can transform and find new paths. "We are here today," Margaret began, her voice clear and emotional, "to celebrate not just a union but a story of transformation, a story that taught us that true love doesn't always follow the path we imagine, but always takes us exactly where we need to be." Ethan and Sarah exchanged vows that spoke of a connection built through understanding, respect, and a deep love for Margaret. They talked about how their differences had turned into complements, and how fate had woven their paths, in unexpected but perfect ways. "For a long time," Ethan said in his vows, "I thought my search was for a traditional family. Today I understand that family is much more than conventions. It's about love, acceptance, and the courage to follow your heart." "You taught me to see beyond appearances," Sarah responded in her vows, "to find truth where I only saw doubts. Our love was born from the purest form of understanding." Margaret, as she declared them husband and wife, felt her heart overflowing with joy. Her new book, which would be released the following month, was exactly about this: how love can transform into something even more beautiful when we have the courage to let it flow naturally. The party that followed was a celebration of joy and authenticity. The guests, only close friends and family members who truly understood and supported their story, danced and celebrated until sunset. 5 years passed since then. Margaret became a nationally recognized writer, her books on education and personal transformation inspiring thousands of people. Her house in the Hamptons transformed into a retreat center for educators and writers, where she shared her wisdom and experience. Ethan and Sarah expanded the Hope Foundation, creating innovative programs that combined technology and access to education. Their love grew and strengthened, proving that the best stories are those written with truth and courage. On a special afternoon, they all gathered again at Margaret's house for a celebration. It was the launch of her new book, The Cycle of Love: How to Let Go to Begin Again. In the dedication, she wrote, "To Ethan and Sarah, who taught me that true love has no defined form, it adapts, grows, and surprises us. And to all those who have the courage to allow love to guide them down unexpected paths." Sitting on the porch, observing the calm sea of the Hamptons, the three shared a moment of deep gratitude. Margaret, with her new book in her lap, Ethan and Sarah with their hands intertwined, and on the horizon a bright future they had built together, based on love, understanding, and the courage to follow their hearts.